Hello, everyone. This is Erica Plank-Hagan. I'm the Communications Manager for the Presbytery of Southern New England, and this is Connecting Our Conversations. It's our podcast space for conversations that push the edges of our faith and help us to deepen discipleship. The Presbytery of Southern New England is a regional governing body in the Presbyterian Church USA. Today, I am talking with representatives from Presbyterian Promise. They're an educational and advocacy group which affirms the welcome of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning people into the life of the church here in our presbytery. Membership includes both individuals and congregations of PSNE. We're also joined today by Tom Steen, who works with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention here in Connecticut. The Connecticut part of it. The organization's stated mission is to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. So, my friends, I was hoping we could take a moment and introduce ourselves. If you could just say your name and how you're connected to the Presbytery and sort of how long you've been here with PSNE. And Tom, if you could just say a little bit about how long you've been in Connecticut. All right, why don't we start with June?
I'm June O'Neill, and I'm affiliated with Presbyterian Promise through First Presbyterian Church in Hartford.
How long have you been in our presbytery, June?
I can't remember. It seems like it's always been.
Always.
I really don't know. It's been many years anyway.
Wonderful. Dick?
Hi, I'm Dick Haspany. I'm co-moderator of Presbyterian Promise. Excuse me, a member of the New Haven Church, where I've been an elder and served on roundtable in the Presbytery.
Nancy?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nancy Basile. I'm the pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Hartford, and I've been a part of this presbytery since I started the ordination process in 2004. Yeah. Woo! Lifetime.
Lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom, welcome.
And thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm a volunteer for AFSP, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and first got to meet Dick and many of your church members about 4 years ago, when you all had a conference and I presented. And so Dick, and you can't say no to Dick. He called me up and said, "Oh, Tom, we really need you." And so I'm glad to give my time today and help with such an important subject. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, we're glad you're here. And it is such an important topic. I'm pulling up an article from USA Today right now on my screen. And this is from May 2nd this year. And key points from it were kind of jarring that LGBTQ students were at least twice as likely to have considered or attempted suicide during the pandemic, according to a CDC study. And LGBTQ youth advocates noted that the pandemic coincided with a rise in anti-LGBTQ legislation and policies nationwide. And what I took from those two things was that we're kind of in a perfect storm right now of something that was always a concern, and then the isolation of the pandemic, and then feeling like policies are passing that are moving us backwards to a more frightening place. Does that sound right? I mean, not right in the world, but correct with the, yeah. So I guess I'm interested in that first part, that it's always been a concern, not just during the pandemic or in this time politically. And with that, I'm hoping you could tell me a little about what drew you to work with Presbyterian Promise and with the mind of LGBTQ youth. Anyone?
Well, I can just start. I think it is important that this to put this in context, a context prior to the pandemic, because suicide is something that has touched our lives in many different ways, personally and professionally, for a long time. Our first connection with it as Presbyterian Promise came at several years ago at the True Colors Conference, which was a statewide, actually beyond the state, statewide a gathering of a couple of thousand LGBT youth and their caregivers and providers and parents and so forth. And we had been there as Presbyterian Promise for several years doing an exhibit to make sure that LGBT youth knew that there was welcoming Christianity. And maybe a couple of years before the pandemic, I noticed that one of the tables that was visited most often, in fact, was busy all day long, was the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which surprised me. I hadn't expected that. It's such a serious topic, and this is a day of exuberance at this conference, but people were visiting that exhibit all day long. I went over and then began to meet people from the foundation and found the kind of work they're doing and the kind of discussions they were having with people who, in the midst of all of this effervescence and all of that sort of stuff, we're taking time to talk about things like suicide. It struck me that this was really important work. I couldn't ignore that. You just can't ignore that. And so we began to work. We worked with Tom and were able to introduce the topic at an open space November 2019 at the Wilton Church Presbytery. The reason I remember that is it's just, if you'll notice, on the cusp of the pandemic. We wanted to do more. We wanted to do more in depth, but that was not to be because we haven't gathered. And we want to return, set the context, and maybe get this discussion going again. So,
well, and it's essential. I mean, if something that was already so important is now even more urgent because of the pandemic and we are not gathering, yes, we want to get back to that, but also I think we want to be sure that churches and our communities are aware of this even when we cannot gather yet, because that urgency is there. June or Nancy, do you have a story?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. I would say that this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart for a lot of reasons, and it's been an important part of my ministry. I wasn't raised in the church context, and so when I decided to pursue ordination, there was no particular tradition like calling to me because I wasn't from a Presbyterian family, and could have gone in a lot of different directions in terms of which ordaining body I sought. I had two wonderful mentors at the time who helped sort of define that it would be Presbyterian. And one of the reasons that I was reluctant was that at the time that I was seeking ordination, the Presbyterian Church still wasn't ordaining gay clergy. And they were sort of chasing down leaders who performed gay marriages. And I was that felt like an affront to my conscience. And I thought to not be part of a church that would do such, would take such a stance. But I was encouraged to join the Presbyterian Church, nevertheless, to be a part of the body that would change our ways of dealing. I didn't feel I could change something from the outside. So to become part of this body faithfully and with a whole heart, to come to it, to like beg it to come home to itself a little bit, I felt like I needed to be a part of it. And so indeed, like the Presbyterian Church has changed its stance, and it's taken way longer than I feel it should have. But I continue to be an advocate for the LGBTQIA plus community, and sort of came to this conversation about suicide from a personal experience. I think each of us has been affected by a suicide in one way or another. For me, it was my high school boyfriend who committed suicide when we were just in our late teens, and who had been a faith exploration partner with me. And I remember the huge impact it made on him to know, or to hear from adults in his life that to be gay was somehow a sin against God. And while he was my boyfriend, he was also someone who was exploring his own sexuality. And I believe in the end of his life, he felt there was no way to be who he was. And so that has really steered the ship and the course of my ministry, especially now as I minister to non-binary youth at my church and kids who are exploring their faith and sexuality at the same time. So I'm trying to create a space at First Presbyterian in Hartford, like alongside June and alongside Pres Promise, that's like a cove, a sanctuary, a resource place, and a place to hear continually how much we each belong to God. And that work goes right alongside, the incarnation, the belief in the incarnation, and each of us being born exactly as God wants us to be. So that's sort of how I got here, and a little bit about what's sustaining my ministry now.
Thank you, Nancy.
Mm.
I do want to jump in here. I noticed in my own body when you were sharing that story, I am queer, and in my own denomination, the Episcopal Church, similarly, it wasn't until the early aughts that things started to shift. So when I was a youth, that it wasn't always a welcoming place. And so hearing your story of your boyfriend brought in my own body some feelings and tensions. And I imagine for some listeners, hearing our stories, both from places of faith and from queerness and about suicide, maybe bringing up stuff for them too. So I just want to remind and honor everybody to pause when you need to and to breathe. And we're going to be listing resources if you need further help. And with that, I kind of hope that Tom can jump in here and maybe talk a little bit about that as we advocate and talk about this stuff as church communities, how we can do so safely.
Yeah, I too had a similar response. I lost a son to suicide. It'll be 13 years this December. And it wasn't until after he died that we found that he was having trouble with his own identity, sexual identity, and that he was bi. And though I don't know if his suicide and that struggle led to it, I certainly think it was a part of it. One of the things in my journey over these past 12, 13 years is to educate and communicate. And that's what we really are doing here today. It's educating and communicating. As spiritual people, and I'm a very spiritual person. I'm not a Presbyterian, I'm a Catholic, but we're all very spiritual in our Christian values, and there's got to be a place for everybody, and to be safe and to be honored. And so I've kind of dedicated my life since then to really focus on how do you know when somebody really is struggling, and what do you do with that information when it is happening. And I look back to my son, he was struggling, but he just didn't know how to say it. He didn't know how to communicate it. And so I hope from today's discussions that the folks that hear us speak today, that they become much more comfortable talking about your mental health. We should be celebrating mental health. We should not be degrading it, and that mental health and physical health are equal. And regardless of where you come from, all of those things really truly apply. So I'm hopeful that my story and Tyler's story obviously is much more in depth. You can see in the background, this was one of his piece of artwork. He was an art student at Savannah College of Arts and Design. And so I try to honor him in that way, and really try to just spread the message that there is hope out there. And there are people that you can go to get that help. And when somebody does come to you looking for help, that you take it seriously and you do all that you can to help that individual. And so I love Reverend Nancy's comments earlier, because and the works that she's doing with the LGBTQ plus community, because that's what we have to do. That's how we have to connect folks, so they know that they're welcome, and that if you need help, it's there.
Well, I think going back to Dick's observation at the event that the table about this was so visited, I think that people really are seeking this help and this acknowledgement that they're not okay. And I imagine our church communities will be a place that will come up. June, can you tell me a little about how you started working with Presbyterian Promise?
Well, it goes back quite a few years. I was a social worker for visiting nurses during the 80s, when there was a lot of AIDS around. And I had so many clients that were dying without any contact with their families. And I didn't have any opinion one way or the other about gay people, because I didn't really know any until I started having clients. And I learned things about hate crimes, never knew that existed. And then seeing people dying. And I didn't question the love that the partners had. You know, that was an education for me. And it's been years since I've had any contact with a sick person with AIDS, because when I worked in a house where AIDS men lived, they were all taking the pill that fortunately came on board. But I think back to the people that I saw 30 years ago, and when they started talking about, you know, having people was contemplating suicide, contacting us, I figured I want to get back into that. I really do. And I hope even at my age that I have something to contribute to people who are hurting and wanting help.
Whew, wow, Jen. I had a thought and it just shifted. So give me a moment. These are big things that we're bringing up. Oh, I do. Sorry. Yes, Dick.
I just wanted to say that we understand at Presbyterian Promise that this is not an LGBT issue alone, and that this is really something that affects all kinds of people, and that we hope that we keep it in that context. That we really mean this for everyone who's suffering and maybe contemplating.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I may, Dick makes a very valid point. Suicide knows no age, no sexual orientation, doesn't know from culture to color to whatever. But suicide is rare, and to prevent suicide is to recognize when somebody really is really struggling. And when I met with the folks back in 2019, I can't believe it was that long ago. The questions in the group were just that: is how can we help? What can we do? How do we have a welcoming, open door to the whole subject? Because I really do that the stigma around it, around suicide or somebody's mental health, is where our challenge really lies. So yeah, it doesn't know any boundaries, suicide. But I want to tell your audience too, it is rare. Suicide is rare. But it is a preventable death. Some people say most. I'm not so keen on that word, but it is preventable as long as we're willing and able to do something about it. And so I'm hoping that this group will bring awareness to that point, because that's so key.
So it sounds to me, what I'm hearing you say is that if you embrace the truth of what is happening, then you are able to help and to give people hope. If you push it away and pretend it's not happening or don't acknowledge the person, that is when things go wrong.
Absolutely correct. Yes.
And I do think there's a parallel to that, to how people want to be seen in their sexuality as well. So obviously crosses all boundaries. And I do think there's a special connection with needing to be seen and honored, and your truth and consequences of not. Oh, so if you could remember back to 2019 or some of the work you've done now, I'm sure people are listening are going, okay, how do we recognize, and then what should we do?
I will, in a shorter version.
I know.
there are risk factors, and somebody that's LGBTQ is a risk factor for suicide. It's just they're 4 times more at risk, not 2 times more at risk. And if they're transgender, it's even higher. It's like 6 times more at risk. So having that open platform for conversation, and and as a lost survivor to suicide, and at the end of the day, it's your faith that carries you through. And it did for me. It took a while. I was very angry at God at the beginning. But I recognized that it really didn't have anything to do with him. But it certainly was something that we could have done here in society to help a person such as my son, Tyler, who was struggling so mightily. But as his brother wrote in his eulogy, that he wrapped a blanket of deception around him that no one could see through. And this is what happens, especially young people that are struggling, whether they're struggling with their identity, or they have depression, or maybe even the early onset of a brain disease such as bipolar or schizophrenia. Just being able to recognize it and be open and honest about it. One of the things that I've learned through working with the LGBTQ community is the struggles that many, especially young people, acceptance of the family as they evolve. And it can be a real struggle. And so I work with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We're working really hard to try to reach out to that community, especially the young people, to know that there's avenues where you can get the support that you need, even though that maybe the family, and I can see Reverend Nancy shaking her head, yes, even though they're not getting that kind of support from the family, that they can, there's just a wider community out there of accepting people that can help. And so that's kind of where AFSP stands when it comes to working with the LGBTQ plus community.
Well, and what a unique place church communities have in that, because when we're doing it good, when we are church, we are family.
Yeah.
And so being seen and accepted there can offer that support structure.
Yeah, and it's, and where do you go when you have suffered such a loss? You head back to where you worship, or if you don't worship, somewhere else. So there are risk factors. The next thing is warning signs, and those are the things that your gut's telling you. And I heard June talk about, and I worked with AIDS population in my YMCA career back in the late 80s and early 90s. So I know where some of your comments, June, came from. There are signs, and we need to trust our gut and then ask, are you thinking about suicide? Are you struggling with your mental health? What are your concerns? I'm here to help you. And one of the challenges that we all have when we get out into the community is it's called a trusted adults. That's the #1 protective factor when it comes to suicide, regardless of age. But certainly with young people, is we have to have those folks. But my wife is my trusted person. And we've had this conversation open, and she knows I come to her with struggles of my mental health. She knows it's real, and we have that vice versa kind of commitment to each other. And I suggest we all need that. And what a better place for that to happen within one's own spirituality, because that to me anyway, that was my strength. That in my journey of healing through the loss of Tyler. And so I don't think about how he died anymore. I really think about how he lived and how much of a positive impact he had in the 21 years he was with us. And to still hear from people from back in those days that Tyler impacted. So it's risk factors, it's warning signs, and protective factors. Those are the 3 elements for folks who are listening today that you really need to understand. But boy, trust your gut. If you think somebody in your life is at risk, trust your gut. Do something about it. As as one of the folks said here today, it's just, don't push it away, embrace it, and help them.
So I want to bring in, it seems to me that in order to trust your gut and to have that kind of understanding of the youth in your community, you need to know them. Like that sounds a bit like their names and who they are. And Nancy, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that in a church worshiping community context, how that can happen organically and how that maybe doesn't always happen.
Wow, that's such a good point. I mean, I can speak to my personal style this way, but I remember time and again that our gospel calls us to remember the people on the fringes, not in that language, but that's the idea, that our faith reminds us continuously to be paying attention to whose voice isn't in the circle. And so as a pastor, man, I feel like it is my job to look every single person in the eye when they walk into that space, the sacred space of worship, or into our church community in whatever form, and that their names be known and that their gender identity be shared if the child wishes to share it. And that I think they're actually, what we haven't talked about this yet, but I think it requires adults to be vulnerable to children in a way too, so that there's an understanding that it's safe to be who you are. Because children and youth are looking to us for cues about like what they can do and say, what's safe in a given space. And if I'm not honest as a pastor to, let's say, the youth that I'm working with, if I'm not honest about the struggles that I've had, about my own mental health journey, about what it means to live with suicide in your history, the effect of suicide in your history, then how can they come forward and tell you? How do they know you're a safe person to speak to? So I feel like one of the roles of the adult leaders, like the helpers, as Tom, the trusted adults, is that we model vulnerability in this way, that we model that it's safe to be exactly how you are. And being mentally ill isn't tantamount to being less effective in your life or less meaningful to a community. So that feels like it's a two-way street, I guess, is what I'm saying. That if we're inviting people's vulnerability about their mental health, we have to share ours too. And then we have to stick with the belief that when we all are our true and full selves, that we can then trust the process of working together, that no one's going to turn around and discount you because you have a mental health problem. No one's going to turn around and say something nasty or exclude you. So there's that first showing up, and then there's the recognition of each other, the mutual recognition of each other's wellness.
I'm going to say a blanket, like probably overly general stereotype as a Midwesterner who has moved to New England.
Oh, yes.
Which is that I feel like people are a little more locked in on their vulnerability here in New England than other places.
So, Erica?
Maybe a little. So I especially want to bring that forward because that's where our Presbytery is, right? We're in this, you pick yourself up by your bootstraps and you get it done on your own. And I love some of that ruggedness and can do in our churches and in our communities. And I think that practicing and being open to vulnerability is good for many things, but for this specifically.
Yeah, and I really think it's like, cool, be rugged, get your stuff done, be amazing, like dig in and be vulnerable. I feel like those two things, those binaries don't have to exist. Yeah. You can be like an incredibly powerful person and somebody who struggles with mental health. Like it's not an opposite.
The more I've learned about queerness and non-binary identities, the more I see it translate to everything.
Yes, it's like at the heart of intersectionality.
Yeah.
That's right. And right. Yeah, so being a Christian and being vulnerable, like those two things, there are a million identities that we live into in our faith lives. And I just feel like maybe there's discomfort with vulnerability because somehow people will feel like they won't be included anymore. They'll be excluded for some marker. But that is, that if, the mainline Protestant church has been on a steady decline for however many years. And I hope that old way of thinking dies and that something new comes forward in this next chapter where we can ditch those binaries and be like our full selves in church and be like amazing places of flourishing.
And I think acknowledging the crisis that's happening now on many levels, but this one we're talking about today specifically can really be a part of that.
I think so too. Yep. It's being real is what will liberate us ultimately. Mhm.
Jen, is anything coming up for you here?
I'm listening, and I'm very, very impressed with what everybody has gone through and willing to offer. And I'm just hoping that I, as an individual, can live up to it.
Oh, I'm just thinking of all of the amazing work you've already done. Like, I hope I can live up to your model example. So Dick, I know that you have hopes for what we can bring forward to the Presbytery as we start to gather and as we start to plan. Why isn't the question I want to ask. What do you think we can do as we start to gather again?
I think we can begin to talk together about this so that we can discover where our needs are, what our experiences are. I'm not sure that we probably have been able to share them. One thing I didn't mention before, at the open space we did at the Wilton Church in 2019, the interest was immense there, just as it had been at True Colors. I don't think that there were ever any larger open spaces, and people stayed afterwards. I think Tom has told me with many, many questions. There's just a lot on our hearts in relation to suicide. So we just need to begin the conversation and see where it will take us. It's possible, it's possible to do some more expert training. We can build some capacity here. That's possible. But if we just start talking about it, I think that's a beginning. And so that's what we're hoping to begin with. But if people are interested in pursuing this, I would love to hear from you and see if we can see what directions we might want to go.
As you all know, I'm a communicator. And so there is nothing like face-to-face connection, especially for being vulnerable and telling these stories. And look, there's that and again. I have been overwhelmed in the pandemic with these new ways we have connect, like what we're doing now on Zoom and how we're doing that. So I have a curiosity with what you just said, if part of how we can connect might also be across the presbyteries, across the presbytery in some way, or between presbyteries. So I'll be interested to see what comes out, how we do. Tom, I'd like to ask you a pretty specific question. We're talking about the importance of being vulnerable and telling stories and being authentic and true. And I have also read that suicide can be contagious, that people who can hear of a suicide, that makes them more likely to commit suicide. Is that true? And if it is, how can we model our stories responsibly? How can we frame them?
That's really three questions in one. Let me see if I can.
I have a lot of questions.
First of all, what research shows us is suicide is not contagious. You're either thinking about suicide or you're not.
Okay.
It's not. Suicide is a symptom of something else going on in a person's life. There's a thing called contagion, though. If you don't use safe practices after a suicide, or react to a suicide loss in the right kind of way, could easily put an individual somewhere within in that space or group more at risk. And how I explain that? Untimely death is untimely death. But when it happens with suicide, and we glorify the loss, or making T-shirts, rather than really being open and honest about the loss, and that there are places to go and to understand. I was at a memorial service here a couple of years ago for a friend's son who died by suicide, and the pastor did such a wonderful job in talking. He didn't hide it. He was upfront and open about it, about the laws. This young man's name was Brian, and that Brian's actions were his own, and he was troubled, and we and in this particular church, I didn't belong to the church, but his message was, that it's okay, and this is rare, and now we need, and that we're so sad about Brian's loss, regardless on how he died, that we now need to support the family and to others within that church, because that kind of death does not only affect the immediate family, it affects a wider community, a wider group. So so the first part is just recognizing it and being open about it. And some families, they're embarrassed and they don't want to push it under the carpet. They don't want to talk about the loss in that way. And we need to respect that too. Unfortunately, those are the folks who probably end up, at church or in a counseling session years later, because you need to deal with it. You need to bring it up. And then there were other families like my family that when we learned that Tyler had taken his own life, we decided to be open and honest about it and began our journey of healing. And it wasn't easy. And that's because of all of the stigma around it. So really important to understand that you can't put suicide in somebody's mind, and why it's so rare is that we all struggle with anxiety and pressure in life, maybe some depression. That doesn't mean we're suicidal. It just means we're depressed, and we need to talk to people then too. It's like, it's okay to be that way. Talk to me. Let's talk it through. Let's be open and honest and self-supporting to that end, because that's when we find out that somebody's in trouble. And it's, oh, okay, let's go see Reverend Nancy. Let's reach out to a counselor. I know somebody that you can talk to, so that we can get people to the places where they can truly get help and help guide them through the struggles that they're happening. There was a third question in that big question. Now I can't remember. But
it'll come up in our minds later if it's
right.
I think, Erica, you asked if there is that connection, how do we sensitively and responsibly raise the topic if indeed it was sort of contagious. I think that was the third question.
That sounds right.
Yeah. Sometimes it's better to be just straight up and forward. When you're thinking about not hurting yourself, but you could present it that way, but you think about killing you, or you do it because people who are thinking about suicide. I'm going to put my teacher's hat on here for a minute. People who are thinking about suicide might not be suicidal or at that crisis point. It's when capacity builds, and with young people, and especially the LGBTQ plus community, it's an impulsive act because a life event occurs. With the LGBTQ community, as they're in the closet, and all of a sudden somebody exposes unwillingly and unwantingly, are all those are warning signs. They're risk factors to warning signs. What we can do as a community is you certainly can guard against that. And because we're open and honest and straightforward, we can be those individuals' champions. And the best way is to ask directly. But there are also more easier ways, or an indirect way to ask, which is you wish you would ever want to go to sleep and not wake up in the morning, or gee, who really cares about me if I was around anyway? No one would miss me tomorrow if I wasn't around. Those are like more subtle ways, and many times, and so we have to be sensitive to both. My advice is when I train suicide prevention programs. It's better to be open and straightforward and honest. And if I can share one more other thing is, and I think you folks agree with me. We need to understand when somebody does reach out for that kind of help, we take the responsibility, because we might be the only person in that individual's life that they're willing to speak to about it. And so as Christians, to me, that's a major responsibility. So, and as in my last dozen years journey here in life, when somebody approaches me or I'm concerned about somebody because I know they're going through the trials and tribulations of life, I ask, how you doing? Go for a cup of coffee. What's going on? You don't seem yourself. And because what the research says, and when the counselors, social workers, some people sometimes are just waiting for somebody to ask. And we really truly find this out by folks with lived experience, people who have attempted and have survived. And over the last 6 to 8 years, we have learned so much more from these folks about what was going on at that point where they were making that ending, potentially life-ending decision. And many times it's just wanting somebody to talk to, just wanting somebody to open up and reach. And so again, as we are Christians here, I think that's our duty, to say, hey, it's okay. And
what just came to my heart, Tom? Do you know the 23rd Psalm, when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and how your shepherd leads you? And I was thinking, what if what gets that person through that shadow is us, is us acting as Christ, loving your neighbor, helping them through.
That dark, deep place.
Yeah.
Folks are in that they just need a helping hand. And my virtual willingness to do that, I believe, it's just my personal, is life-saving. It can clearly be life-saving. And I can share with you, if we had 20 hours, I could share with you example after example of people of experience I've had and experiences that other folks have shared with me, that it's truly, it's just a matter of asking and accepting. I think that when I talk to the folks in the LGBTQ plus community, whether they're adults or young people, wherever they are, they just want to be accepted. And so when Dick asked me to be a part of this, sign me up, because that's really what it's all about. It's about acceptance. And if we can get there as a society, I think we'd all move along a whole lot easier and a whole lot healthier.
Amen. My friends, I feel like we could talk for hours and wouldn't even scratch the surface, but I think it's time for us to close this conversation with an invitation to the Presbytery to move it forward, that if this sparks something in people, to reach out to Presbyterian Promise, and that they have the relationship with Tom, and that I think this is just the beginning. I really appreciate your time here today. I can't tell you how touching this has been. I'm feeling a lot right now. And again, to people listening or watching, if you're feeling a lot right now, please take care of yourself.
Erica, us today, it's really, we're sort of all meeting from different places, and I have to say it's such a pleasure to get to connect even here. I'd love to be with y'all in person, but this is awesome too. Thanks for having me.
The name of the podcast is Connecting Our Conversations. All right.
If I may share something of this,
quick.
Not a political point, but it's still, there's no such thing as social distancing. We are social beings. We can't social distance. We can physical distance because of this thing that's been going around and folks getting sick. Yeah, we got to take care of it, but we got to share air.
Yeah,
that's the only way we're going to get our health back here through this pandemic. There's a mental health crisis going on in our country now. Yeah, there's a pandemic, but there's a mental health crisis. And so whenever we can, and I hope soon, I can be with the 4 of you and maybe others, so that we can share air and be with Christ, and be with fellow man, because that's what truly, to me, is what it's all about. That's how we're all going to stay healthy through these sometimes difficult times.
Can't stop the church. Amen.
Yeah.
All right.
give that an amen to.